Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. As I'm recording this introduction, Donald Trump has just released on his social media an AI-generated video of a future Gaza which has been rebuilt into a gaudy Western American and Israeli resort town, complete with golden statues of Trump and Elon Musk eating hummus. Like so much that comes from the Trump administration, it's at once preposterous, grotesque, and in its implications, profoundly evil. This conflict, particularly the latest phase of it since October 7th, is something I've been meaning to devote an episode on the podcast to for some time now. I've discussed it in passing with guests and on a couple of solo episodes, but I have been meaning to give it an episode in its own right. Before the American election, I wrote a solo episode directed at my friends on the anti-war left, for whom the Biden administration's continuing support of Israel was a potential deal breaker, arguing that while many of their concerns were very legitimate, absentee voting or third-party voting and allowing Trump to win wasn't the right answer. I reworked that episode a few times and eventually didn't release it. My view remains the same. Indeed, I really went the opposite way with it. Part of the reason I felt it was so important to oppose Trump was his foreign policy, which I thought would be destabilizing, which I thought for both Palestine and Ukraine would take what was already a very bad situation and make it worse, and indeed possibly mean that both of those nations ceased to exist at some point down the road. And so far from Trump, that fear seems to be at least partially vindicated. With all that said, I think it was right not to release that episode. I think this is a topic challenging and consequential enough that it deserves to be talked about and analysed on its own terms, rather than through the filter of American electoral politics. And that's what this episode is. This is an episode on the relationship between America and Israel, starting with a backwards-looking analysis and evaluation of the Biden administration's approach, and then followed by a more forward-looking, both practical and moral critique of the Trump administration and their so-called plan for Gaza that I alluded to, both how dangerous and immoral that is, but also why some people are buying into it or being taken in by it. My guest today, I'm always very happy, indeed eager to admit the things that I don't know and I'm not well placed to talk on, and I know the American side of this. I don't know particularly well the Israeli domestic politics side, or for that matter, I'm not a military person. I just don't know those frameworks particularly well. So my guest today is someone who understands both of those things at a very high level, which I really appreciated. I'm joined today by Avishay Ben-Sasson-Gordis. He is a Liberalism Rekindled postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a Ruderman Family Foundation scholar in residence and senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University. His work focuses on the democratic theory of coercive political institutions. His book project, Not Just War, offers a normative theory of democratic civil-military relations, and his empirical research centres on Israeli security policy, governing institutions, and public opinion. I won't do any more preamble than that. I'm tempted to start this episode with a long, self-involved statement of my own views of this conflict and where I stand. I won't. I think I give my evaluation of Biden and Trump in this episode, and I make my own position clear. As much as anything, though, what I was trying to do with this episode is understand, both for myself and the audience, where we are in this terrible situation and where we might be going. So I'll leave it there. Apart from, as always, if you do appreciate this show and these types of conversations, please do consider sponsoring on Patreon. I've actually had a number of people, including a number of people who work in the field, in political theory and philosophy, sign up to support the show recently, which I am very honoured and grateful for, so thank you so much, everyone, for doing that. I really appreciate it. And if you'd like to join them, I've been suggesting chipping in $2 an episode, so, a cup of coffee, but whatever seems right to you. And you can do that at patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. Links to everything else are on my website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Okay, let's get straight to it then. This is Biden, Trump, and Israel. I am here with Avishay Ben-Sasson-Gordis. Avishay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Toby.
Yeah, no, I've been looking forward to this one because I feel like we've been I don't know how you'd say it, but online friends for a while, right? We've chewed the fat on American politics since the old Twitter days, really.
Right, before it went evil.
Before it went evil, yeah, and we're going to do the Trump-Israel relationship now, which I think has been somewhat undercovered. I did want to start, before we get to what's going on now, maybe with something of a review of the Biden relationship and what got us here. Let me give you my impression of the American side. You can maybe add to that, but then hopefully fill in some details on the Israel side, which I must admit I'm less familiar with. My impression of Biden in this respect is somewhere in the middle, from his strongest critics to his strongest defenders. From the reporting I've read, he was genuinely shocked by the October attack by Hamas. And I'm sure the president sees all sorts of horrible things, but apparently this one did personally affect him. I think his signalling of support for Israel was genuine enough as these things go. I think the narrative that he was that has emerged on some sections of the left, that he was just pro-genocide of Palestinians from the very start, also clearly goes too far. I think he very much envisaged an Israeli response, but a much more limited, much more sort of counter-terrorism thing than we actually ended up getting, and then did try to persuade a bit of a different path in which we would get, like I say, a more limited response and then a return to peace talks. With all that said, I think, that's not fully exculpatory either. Whatever we make of that process, it has to be said that whatever the Biden policy in this respect failed, right? If the goal was a more limited conflict followed by a return to peace talks, that's not really what we got. And we can maybe discuss why his administration's foreign policy in that respect was unsuccessful. But that's sort of my overall take on how the Biden administration saw things. How did that look from the other side?
So, first of all, let's note that we're talking about the Biden administration, like you framed it, post October 7th, because there's a
Yeah.
whole conversation to be had about the 2.5 years preceding that, or 3 years. But even just focusing on that time frame, it's helpful to ask what Biden and his people were looking to achieve in respect to Israel in the war, and think about it in that context. And I think they had several goals, one of which was to defend Israel. I think you're correct that the immediate response was shock, horror, and concern. One of the first things that Biden did, and I think was incredibly important in terms of securing Israel's actual basic security, kind of the state's basic ability to meet its security needs, was his commitment to defending Israel against aggression from Hezbollah and Iran. Whether it appears that they didn't intend to join, but on October 7th, Israel was in disarray, and having the American commitment that it will not allow Israel to be attacked in a major way was incredibly important. It was also received in that way in Israel. So while Israelis would later sour, if we're generalizing, on the Biden administration, in the first leg of the war, Biden was perceived incredibly positively, including his visit to the region and his address to the Israeli people. And I can understand why Palestinians experienced it in a diametrically opposed fashion. Israelis experienced that incredibly positively. So protecting Israel was the first thing. Apart from that, I think three other goals were immediately drawn up and put into motion. One was to restrict the war from expanding, not just for Israel's sake, but for the region's sake and for the sake of American interests in the region. So one thing that's been reported is that the U.S. Resisted Israeli plans to attack in Lebanon immediately at the outset of the war, and pretty quickly throughout the war has attempted, and pretty quickly and then all throughout the war, attempted to close down every time the conflict seemed like it was going to expand much broader, in a much broader fashion. So sending their Lebanon mediator, Ambassador Amos Hochstein, to Lebanon and trying to negotiate ceasefires even before things could close down in Gaza was one of the things they did. When Israel and Iran got into direct conflict, try and contain that conflict in various ways. So I think that was a second goal. A third goal was to restrict the harm to Palestinian civilians or non-combatants. And I think most of the criticism that we see from the left in the world in general, in the U.S. in particular, against the previous administration comes on the background of what is taken to be a complete and utter failure in this regard, especially as the administration continued supplying Israel with arms throughout the war and international backing in various international fora. And finally, the third element was to try and tie the travesty, the disaster of October 7th into a regional reshaping in the direction of peace. And Blinken's plans, along with the Saudis, to try and convince Israel to commit to some path forward on Palestinian, we can call it statehood. It wasn't a concrete plan to set up a Palestinian state, but try to commit to something of the sort was aimed in that direction. And from everything I can judge, both conversations with people involved, with think tanks in DC, with people involved on the Israeli side, gave me the impression that this was a sincere effort. How effective and how well managed is a separate question, but definitely a sincere effort. And now maybe it's important to note a fourth issue that Biden took very seriously was the issue of the hostages. So if it seemed at times that the Israeli government was seeing this as a secondary issue, for Biden, whose capacity for interpersonal empathy, I think, is under little doubt, even if people doubt his ability to see Palestinians. I know on the left, people doubt his ability to see Palestinians as equally deserving of recognition as Israelis, I think the interpersonal dimension is there. And so when he was meeting with families of hostages, particularly American hostages, but not only American hostages, that was a genuine concern of his.
I think you're right that of those many goals, the one that the anti-war movement was sort of assessing, the administration one, was the preventing Palestinian civilian casualties. Because you could have also assessed it along the lines, as you say, of are we laying the foundations of being able to return to a peace process after? That's another strategic goal. How, staying within their chosen metric, how do we assess the administration on that front? Because, again, my immediate impression, just sort of knowing the American side, is somewhere in the middle. There's a refrain of many people sort of on the anti-war left who I know, that Biden could have ended this with a phone call, and that seems hyperbolic to me. Like, it doesn't seem credible to me that he publicly pressures Netanyahu for a ceasefire and doesn't get one, but then in a private phone call could somehow just act tough and get him to do it. That seems a little fantastical. On the other hand, it does seem like there is something to the critique that the administration never really contemplated taking measures that would imperil the American-Israeli alliance, like the request to sort of stop arming or funding Israel. They might tamper around the edges, but to put it a different way, when asked, is there anything Israel could do that would undermine your support for them, they never really seemed to have an answer to that question. So, yeah, how do we assess the efficacy of the Biden administration with respect to just the narrow goal of preventing Palestinian casualties, civilian casualties?
The question of assessing efficacy, I think, is interestingly put, because it's a consequentialist measure, right? We're asking how many deaths were there, and whether those deaths could have been prevented. It's a counterfactual question in a way. If I may be a little philosophical about something that is incredibly visceral, and it's a tendency that those of us trained in political theory and philosophy sometimes have, that people take offense to. But I think it is helpful in thinking about the world in a certain way. And I think against that question, they had an effect. So the American pressure had an effect. And I think the belief that there was a phone call that could have been made realistically, I'll come back to what that realistically means in a second, is a little dismissive of Israeli agency.
Mm.
And this is where I think it's helpful to think about Israeli domestic politics. In the aftermath of October 7th, Israel has several elements that are pushing it to exert force. So let's think about those for a second and how they lead to Palestinian casualties, massive Palestinian casualties. One is a set of what I would call illegitimate concerns. So Israelis are hurt and afraid and feeling vengeful. Again, generalizing in a massive way. Some of the people most harmed by the attack in the Gaza region itself, on the Israeli side of the border, are peace activists who continue to exhibit inhuman amounts of forgiveness and compassion. But Israelis as a whole don't feel that in the aftermath of October 7th, with the images and the sounds etched into their minds again and again. That doesn't justify any sort of disproportional action, but it helps explain it. And I think that's something that Israeli leaders were feeling themselves, at least in the initial steps. So when Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was charged in the ICC for his complicitness in crimes against humanity or in violations of the morality of war, most of the quotes I think from him came from those first few days. They didn't come from later on in the war, because I think at least initially the shock was such that they didn't speak in a measured way. Others spoke in a measured way, and that measured way was atrocious. But I think for some of them that wasn't the case. And then there were other more, and that led at least to disregard, or to a willingness to disregard Palestinian harm and suffering in ways that shouldn't have been permitted. Then there were actual military reasons that fall within the realm of legitimate conversations about the legality and morality of war. So proportionality, one of the measures of a justness of a war, is not measured against what was done to you. It's not there were 1,400 Israelis killed and 250 or so kidnapped. Israel can now kill 4x that time and kidnap or arrest 5x that time. That's not how proportionality works. There's a misperception of how that functions in just war. The way proportionality works is proportionality works against the military utility of your target. And given the way Hamas built itself in Gaza, embedded within civilian population, using civilian installations, including ones that should be off limit, Hamas indeed used schools, despite the fact that Israel's big showcase of the Shifa hospital was a dud. Hamas did indeed use hospitals as military installations, and the same goes for schools. Hamas built an entire underground city under the city of Gaza, under houses and nurseries and so on and so forth. It's not just Israeli propaganda. It is indeed true. This is propaganda using facts on the ground. And so when Israel needed to operate, if you think, and I tend to think that at least in the aftermath of October 7th, Israel had just cause to move against Hamas as an organization, Hamas as a government, then that movement entailed some degree of non-combatant suffering. What Israel didn't do enough of, and I think the administration pressured it, sometimes successfully, and you could see the changes where it happened. Netanyahu had to push it through his very far-right coalition. He used the American pressure to help him put some of these measures through, was in the flow of humanitarian aid, which shifted quite a bit throughout the war. Initially, there was none, then there was more, then there was less again. The delay of the operation in Rafah until the civilian population could be moved, where I think when we're grading the administration, one of the failures was that the administration posed Rafah as a red line, assuming Israel couldn't move population out of the area in any significant numbers, which Israel then did. And then when Israel operated, the administration had a hard time of explaining why it was that if the civilians were no longer there in quite the same numbers that they were there before, Israel shouldn't do it, and it had to equivocate and speak on both sides of the issue, and I think that's where it justifiably got a lot of flack. Again, when we talk about this is something that is important for me to say. I'm not justifying, in this case, anything specific in terms of the action. I'm not saying Rafah was or wasn't okay, or moving them in this or that way was or wasn't okay. I'm trying to explain the disconnect between the experience of the war on the Israeli way in which it was managed versus how it was perceived outside, versus the communication between Israel and the administration, to better understand how things look like from these various perspectives. And so I think with time, what tended to happen is that Israelis realized that they could actually move quite a bit around American pressure, and I'll get back to the issue of the arms embargo in a second. And that Israel could effectively push back against the administration. And as the elections drew nearer, that Biden's freedom of action, political freedom of action, became increasingly smaller. Once he fell out of the race, even more so, he was considered a lame duck, and the administration couldn't afford to be perceived as if it wasn't allowing Israel to operate because for either independence in the U.S. or key demographics in some of the swing states. It was a real concern about how things would look like. And things look like, I know that on the American left, I'm on Blue Sky, this is most of what I hear most of the time. The feeling was that most of the punishment that the administration got was from throwing the Palestinians under the bus. I think it's difficult to know and tell exactly how much of the perception of the weakness of the administration had to do with the opposite. I don't think either of them was decisive. You've talked about the election, I know, and analyzed the results. And so you're a better authority on this than me, but I don't think this was decisive. But I think both sides of this played, and in a very close election within the administration, there was a concern about this. Which brings us to the issue of the arms embargo. Both because of the commitment to Israel that is shared much more widely among the political class than it might be among the Democratic base. And the sense that Israel had legitimate concerns in pursuing the war that couldn't be teased apart with an arms embargo. It didn't seem like an advisable way to move forward. Moreover, if the president had tried to do anything of the sort, Congress would have overridden him. Mm-hmm. Now, we see now what it looks like when a president decides to disregard any sort of railing and guardrails on his power. But I don't think the Biden administration considered presidential power in quite the same way. So that wasn't an option that was available to them. So I'm not saying that the administration was successful. Clearly, the administration failed miserably in getting Israel to do what at least the anti-war movement wanted. But I think the administration did quite a bit in mitigating some harms and in getting Israel to take note of some concerns and move a little more slowly in a little more measured way. I know it sounds, there are those to whom this is going to sound, if this is the measured version, what was the unmeasured version? And I think one of the things we see over time is Israeli aerial bombings were actually becoming more discriminate as time went through. And Israel realized that the initial rage, in the initial sense that you could uproot Hamas very quickly, had to give way to something else and a different way of acting. And I think some of that is to do with American pressure, if not a lot of it.
Yeah, that's similar to where I land. To just start with, you mentioned the political effects. I think you're right. I think this didn't help them. I think it wasn't determinative of the election result. I also think for the people who were loudest on the sort of train that, and we should say the mainstream anti-war left, the what gets called the uncommitted movement, they reached a sort of compromise position where they didn't vote for Kamala in the primary. They didn't endorse Kamala, but they did vote for her and advocate others do the same. And you might wonder what the distinction is there, but I think in the symbolism of American politics, that's a meaningful position to take. For the people who were flat, we cannot vote for the administration, they need to be punished for this, my impression is they were working their way there anyway, and this certainly gave them a much more forceful language to express that in, but I think they would have mostly got there anyway. And yes, it probably hurt them at the margin with, like, liberal, college-educated young people. My overall impression, though, is if it harmed them, it wasn't so much people who felt very strongly either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. It was more a general sense that things just weren't going well in the world, that they didn't have a handle on things, that you needed a tough guy in charge, a kind of like low information middle voter of, like, you know, maybe who just the world over has an instinct that in times of conflict you need a real asshole in a seat of power. I think that as much as anything, that might be it. I agree. I think the anti-war left is correct to be concerned with civilian casualties, and I think it's correct, you know, certainly when it comes to, like, supplying humanitarian aid and so on, to be concerned with these things. I think you said Israeli agency, that's so right. I think there's a perception on the anti-war left that Israel is a client state of America, and it just isn't. Like, America has influence, quite a lot of influence, but there was a poll in Israel a few months back that if there was the choice between losing the American alliance and having a true two-state solution, most Israelis would rather lose the American alliance. Well, that's the electorate that Netanyahu answers to, and that's and I mean, I do think that a more subtle critique of, maybe America could have held to its red lines, maybe there's more that could have been done. I think that's fair enough. But the idea that they could have just unilaterally said knock it off seems a little fantastical. You're quite right. Like, to cut off, the way America funds Israel is complicated, and some of it runs through Congress and some of it doesn't, and the big chunks of it are congressionally approved. It nonetheless does end up in a slightly ridiculous position where America provides arms and then begs Israel not to use them. That just seems like such a strange place for a superpower to land. And I think it's fair enough that people would look at that and think, that can't be where we land as what good policy is. So I think it's messy, but that's sort of my evaluation on that's my sort of where I land with Biden. And it has to be just said of one of the least effective parts of that administration, and a lot of people, yeah.
It was certainly. So I'll just say I'm not familiar with the poll you suggested, but I understand the underlying sentiment, and I think it's probably reflective of at least a large number of Israelis. So
yeah,
in that respect, that sounds right to me. And the thing about the bombs, the idea that you put it beautifully, the sending the bombs and then asking Israel not to use them, is the way I would put it, which is not quite as pithy, is sending the bombs, asking Israel to use some of them for certain purposes, but but then not use them all quite the same way that Israel wants to use them. And then Israel uses some of them, but then a little more in other places. The whole thing is very, very messy. And I think what some of Biden's critics will point to is that he didn't just do what was congressionally mandated, but he went above and beyond to waive requirements and to expedite shipments of most weapons other than those heavy bombs. On the Israeli side, there was a feeling that friction got added to the system as it went through, whether it was because of White House intervention or State Department bureaucracy or Pentagon bureaucracy, or whatever the case may be. But I still think that the bigger picture is that there was strong American support for the Israeli effort.
Mm-hmm.
And even when Israel wouldn't commit to the day after plan, which we didn't say much about up until now, we sort of focused on the civilian casualties, but there was also this side of connecting this to a peace process, which, if there's anything that the Israeli government really resisted, it was this, the idea that this could connect to Palestinian statehood. And given the composition of the government that includes some of the most far-right elements within Israeli politics, not some of the most far-right elements within Israeli parliamentary politics, they used the war to entrench the worst practices in the West Bank at the same time. And this is the part that, other than the people who are very close watchers of the conflict, was elided in all of this. People focused on what was happening in Gaza, where there was some semblance of just war, while at the same time in the West Bank, some of what was happening had no justification whatsoever, or a claim for a justification. And I think that was a bigger issue until at some point.
Because you can imagine, this is very hypothetical, but you can imagine an Israeli administration that goes very hawkish on Gaza and dovish on the West Bank, that says, look, screw Hamas and these people, we don't recognize this as like a legitimate national liberation movement. These guys are just terrorists, and we're going to go after them. And there's no way to do that will have no civilian casualties. And we are ultimately going to go for something like regime change in Gaza. At the same time, we want to signal to the Palestinians and the world that we are very pro national liberation in a way that doesn't threaten us. So to the extent that there are people on the West Bank who will acknowledge Israel and in some capacity work with us, we're going to do everything to help to support them. We're going to throw money at them. We're going to start, at the very least, limiting new settlements. You know, you can imagine someone who took almost like a binary approach. That's very much not what we got, you know. And, you know, that might have made sense. That might have been the most moral outcome, but it wasn't. It wasn't what happened, obviously.
Indeed, and I think that's what the Biden administration was calling on Israel to do. The Biden administration said, look, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to take these moderates, reform them, make them more effective. The PA is not an effective government. It's relatively corrupt. The Palestinians view it as a security subcontractor for Israel. Israel views it as a semi-effective subcontractor. It's not a terribly effective government, but the idea was we can reform it with the help of other Arab regimes and international involvement. And now there's a legitimate reason to bring them into Gaza on the backs of Israeli tanks in a way that there might not have been before. And that was the logic behind the Blinken plan. And the composition of the Israeli government, whether it's Netanyahu himself or more importantly, his coalition allies, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, would never let that happen. We even see it now where Smotrich is threatening that even with Trump in the White House, and maybe we can shift to talking about Trump, that even with Trump in the White House, he is not going to stick around if the war ends, because he's committed to the idea of occupying Gaza, putting Israeli forces in charge of every aspect of life there, and eventually pushing the Palestinians out.
Do you think, moving forward to Trump, as you say, do you think the timing of the recent ceasefire deal, the most recent one, was made with an eye to American politics, that they didn't want to give Biden a win before the election, and they, I'm primarily thinking Netanyahu, did seem to want to give Trump a win?
I can't rule that out. And just for the benefit of the listeners, I'll say we're having this conversation the day after one of the final exchanges of the first stage of the ceasefire deal, one in which the bodies of two young children, essentially toddlers, murdered by Hamas, were returned to Israel, along with the body of an 80-year-old peace activist, an anti-government kibbutznik, and the mother of the children's body was not returned to Israel. So now, as we speak, we're not quite sure. The Palestinians returned a body of what appears to be a Gazan woman, and we don't know whether or not the ceasefire will continue and in what shape. So I don't know, when you listen to this, what exactly the state of affairs of things is. But at the time of speaking, there's the ceasefire. I don't know for a fact that Netanyahu, I don't have direct evidence that Netanyahu held off on it in order to reward Trump and not reward Biden. I do have good or reliable to me indications in Israeli media and in conversations with people that pressure from the Trump administration actually played a big role in forcing Netanyahu into a deal right now, and also in allowing him into a deal right now. So Netanyahu resisted a deal in large part in order to not lose his coalition and be forced into a minority, and perhaps be forced to run an election that he's not certain is going to win, because after October 7th, he still has trouble soaring in polling. So timing definitely had something to do with the entry of the Trump administration. Also helpful was the fact that between the collapse of the Syrian regime, the victory against Hezbollah in the fight in southern Lebanon, and the profound change in the state of security on Israel's northern border, and Israel's most recent attack in Iran that wasn't retaliated, the retaliation to the major Iranian missile attack on Israel. Israel destroyed a large part of Iranian strategic air defenses and left Iranian airspace exposed to further Israeli attacks in a way that is concerning to the Iranians and changes their calculus and destroyed some of the infrastructure for the production of surface-to-surface missiles. The overall security situation in which Israel is conducting a deal is different. So when I'm asking myself what changed in terms of the politics, both international politics and domestic politics of it, one is a set of victories that relieved some of the pressure Israel had around its, let's call it strategic deterrence, not any definite deterrence, but deterrence against the sense that Israel is weak. This is something that Israeli decision makers are constantly very concerned with and have been very concerned with after October 7th. Israel sees itself as existing. You'll hear Israeli decision makers often speak about a dangerous neighborhood. It's this term that comes up again and again. And so in a dangerous neighborhood, you have to exude power. And that's one thing that has changed after the recent set of successes. The other part of this that changed is the direct pressure from Trump, who really wanted to see the war end for whatever reason. He has made it clear again and again. And even now with the bluster, he continues to say that he wants the deal to continue. He doesn't want the deal to collapse and for Israel to attack Hamas. He's willing, according, if we are to believe his rhetoric, to see Israel go all out in war. He's not concerned about the humanitarian well-being of Palestinians. That's not a major concern for him, but he does want to see the deal go through all its stages. And the third thing I would say is Netanyahu's government hangs by a thread. He's got a very slim Knesset majority. It's a stable Knesset majority. There's no one who can, the opposition can't build a counter majority and depose him, but it's also not a stable majority. And Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the two furthest right members of his coalition, have been threatening throughout the war that should Israel, and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the two far-right members of his coalition, have been threatening throughout the war from very early on that should Israel move to end the war without Hamas being fully removed or without an attempt to bring back all of the hostages in one go, they would exit the government and topple it. And Ben-Gvir has in fact exited the government. Smotrich stayed in. And that was possible only because there were a set of political machinations that Netanyahu succeeded in slightly stabilizing his coalition a little more, giving him some leeway against Ben-Gvir, and using Trump's promises about either emptying Gaza of Palestinians or giving some room for Israeli annexation in the West Bank. He hasn't said anything definite about it, but he said, I'm going to say something about it in the future, has given Netanyahu some space to keep Smotrich and the coalition, sustaining his coalition a little further. So for all three of these reasons, a change in the geopolitics, Trump's direct pressure, which Netanyahu was much more responsive to than Biden. I think there's some degree of personal concern there about the way in which Trump conducts himself in the world. Imagine him standing up, speaking against Netanyahu this way, in the way that he's been speaking against Zelensky. It's not unthinkable. And the third part is the coalition politics within Israel. All three of those made the ceasefire possible at the time that it became possible.
What do we make of Trump's? I mean, are we relegating this to pure bluster? Trump's repeated at this point idea that we should fully depopulate. I'm trying to think how polite we want to be this term, ethnically cleanse, if you want to go up to that, the Gaza Strip, and America take possession of it. And my read of this is this literally what's going to happen? No. Should we like just, oh, well, it's just, should we disregard it either? No, I think what Trump is doing is verbally committing to an aggressive non-concern for Palestinian life, for any sort of sense of national self-determination. He's saying very clearly, I mean, America, you might say, has always been on Israel's side, but has always attempted to maintain something of a persona of an impartial arbitrator, or even if not impartial, at least someone who can sit both sides down. I think what Trump is trying to say here is that is no longer the case, right? we are no longer at all concerned with one side.
My general approach to thinking about American foreign policy in the age of Trump, or at least Trump's foreign policy in the age of Trump, is that we should be more cautious in analyzing it in the standard language of political analysis. We have a tendency, those of us who think systematically about politics, to try and make sense and dignify ideas. And I think the way to talk about these things in the age of Trump, at least some of them, is more in the realm of intuitions, knee-jerk reactions, dispositions.
Yeah.
The language of not emotions in the reductive way or the negative way some people sometimes say, this is too emotional, hence it's bad. This is not the emotion is what is making it bad. Biden's empathy is an emotion, and we don't think it's bad. But it's not coming from the sense of somebody planning out 6 stages ahead how this is going to play out. You know, how people described Obama's foreign policy. This is much more in the realm of, this idea has the shape of an idea that makes sense to me. And I also think that people who have been in games for whatever game it is, whatever profession it is, for a long enough time, develop an intuition about certain ways of moving within the game. And I think one way in which we know Trump sees the world is transactional.
Yeah.
And he has the sense of, when you are threatened in a negotiation situation, you raise the gambit. You up the stakes. You make it bigger. As well as, if this is about land, I know how to deal with land. You move the tenants out and you build something nicer. You pay them whatever needs to be paid, not fair market value, but competitive market value or power manipulated market value. And you build on the territory that's been cleaned up. And in a very real sense, he's looking at Gaza and he says, this is a slum that's been destroyed. I can now build things there. And it connects to his basic, again, intuition, just listening to him, that America needs to grow territorially. What's the plan about how to get there and how this works? There isn't one. Is it in a way of throwing the conversation into flux and forcing new ideas? That might be that as well. But I don't think there was a measured moment where they said, we're going to offer this outlandish idea, and then people will force us to dial it back. And in the process, we'll get the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Saudis involved in a way that they weren't before. Although it seems to have happened. Again, when we are speaking, the Saudi king is gathering other Arab leaders in order to concoct a plan to counter or to build on Trump's ideas in ways that wouldn't force Palestinian out of the area. And I know that in America, Trump's plan polls badly. In Israel, it polls fantastically. For a person like me who's worried about the moral dimensions of it and the practical dimensions of it and how it might destabilize Jordan and how it might destabilize Egypt, Israel's neighbors with whom it has peace accords, this is very concerning to me, like on a strategic level as well as on a moral level. But I gotta say, for most Israelis, Trump has opened up a moral permission to have a conversation that Israelis were waiting to have.
Right.
Like,
I mean, and this is
the problem go away.
Yeah, this is the thing that I'm pushing back on, is not, do I think there's a sort of A to B to C plan to what Trump's laying out? Well, at the very least, some of the middle steps are missing, right? They have this vision of, what did he call it, like a Riviera or something. The exact A to B there isn't, at the very least, that's not spelled out. And I think there's an instinct in a certain class of American centrist pundit to say, because there's not the A to B there, that this is quote unquote just Trump being Trump, and we should just regard it at the level of, like, a nice little fantasy sketch. And as you say, that even if, like, this isn't literally what's going to happen, it has given people. I mean, look, there's always been an element within Israel who thought it might not quite have said it publicly, although some have, that the end game here is a one-state solution in which the Palestinians are completely expelled. That everything else is ruled out. We can't live peaceably with them. That there'll never be an end to war. Either we win or they do, and we're going to win. One people are going to force the other out, and that's just it. And yeah, what Trump does gives that conversation permission to start happening now.
So I think you're entirely correct that element has existed within Israeli politics. Smotrich, the head of a party he's now polling under the threshold, but he's not a big party. But he's been speaking in this language for years. He came out with an article in 2017 called The Decision Plan that called to do this in the West Bank at the time. He didn't imagine that he'd be allowed to do it in Gaza, but now he sees it happening in front of his eyes. And everything, he has this funny rhetorical move. I see it happening all the time where something bad happens, therefore, for our security, we must push all the Palestinians out. Whatever the case may be, like everything causally leads to the same place because he actually, like you said, wants it to happen, both as a religious expression of his beliefs about the necessary end state of what Israel is to be as a manifestation of divine will in the world. He's a religious fanatic. And as a security standpoint, he is committed to the idea of Jewish supremacy as the main political platform of Israeli existence. And thinking about your audience, I assume some people will react to what I just said and think to themselves, well, everything about Israel, Zionism, is Jewish supremacy. But I think there's a huge difference between the idea that says there's going to be basic civic equality of some sort with deviations that account for the particular facts of Jewish history. Or things happened in 1948 during a war of an ethnic conflict of independence that shouldn't happen again later on. There are various ways of parsing it, but I think the position that goes all the way to say we should be actively pursuing ethnic cleansing used to be on the margins. After October 7th, several things happened. First of all, the shock and horror of the attack itself shift the conversation within Israel, making that a position, at least for a time. Polling shows that it shrunk back down afterwards. But there was a moment where that seemed like a more legitimate thing. But the sense that a lot of Israelis feel that says, if only we didn't have to deal with this, if only the problem went away, is, while I don't condone it, understandable to me. Now, where it becomes, like you say, impractical is like, okay, so let's say you offer them, and this is, maybe I'll take a step back and say something about the imagination of this. So I think for Israelis who are not within this camp of Jewish supremacy, the idea of voluntary exit of Palestinians, where they get compensated and the world supports us in carrying this out, and the world helps them get absorbed at a time where refugee crises are everywhere, and the U.S. is in the process of purging its immigrating communities. Somehow all of this is supposed to live together. I'm not entirely sure how, but yet they imagine this to be happening under a framework of consent.
Right, and this is what makes it so dangerous, is my understanding of Palestinian public opinion, and certainly is there's not going to be real consent here. Like, no, we're not getting 2 million, 4 million, however many people to all just agree to this because we've offered them 20 grand each or something. Like, Palestinian nationalism is a real thing. People are really locked in the same way as Israeli nationalism is a real thing. Like, this isn't just going away. And like, one of the big ideological constants of our world is that nationalistic commitments aren't going away. And in the Palestinian case, you could maybe even put a more claim and say it shouldn't go away. Like, but regardless, it's not. But it seems to me that like a lot of people, a lot of like the center of the Israeli electorate and a lot of politicians are kind of living in two worlds at once. Like, on the one hand, Trump plan, yeah, that sounds great. On the other, we still want to do this peace deal. We're not quite ready to go back to full war. We want the hostages back. We don't know where that process ends either, but it's like two half-finished thoughts. Let's wrap this up, get the hostages home. What happens next? God knows. Two, we've got this overarching vision of, like you say, consensual depopulation. How do we get there? God knows. And there's just not... I mean, if you think there's a coherence to be had there, I welcome you telling me, but it just seems a very dangerous form of half-thinking on both sides.
I think it is, and I think there's something genuinely fascinating, stunning, depending on which way you want to think about it, that a people who, in a very, very real sense, for 2,000 years have kept the idea of return to their homes alive, are willing to just assume that for other people that's going to fall out of their, and that's the Jewish people, for those, if it's not obvious, for whom we've kept this idea alive for 2,000 years. And to think that it'll just go away overnight because we paid people $20,000 and sent them to Belgium or to Egypt or whatever the case may be, where they live as second-class citizens, is just going to go away is fantastical to me. And on top of that, the assumption that everybody will just go. There are about 2 million people in Gaza, that every single one of them will take the deal. And if there are 400,000 who don't take the deal, what do you do now? Do you forcibly evict them? And then your fantasy of this happening under the guise of consent goes away. And like, this is the political philosophy podcast. Let's talk about the idea of consent. When we talk about consent, the reason consent is doing so much work here is because everybody who grew up within a liberal world, and in a way all of us have, a world shaped by liberalism is a world in which consent has a very special power. It's what, as one of my teachers, David, used to say, it's what turns a punch from an assault to a game. And if that's the case, it has a very strong grasp on our emotional, it has a very strong grasp on our moral thinking and on our moral accounting. And people who would otherwise not agree to this sort of purge become amenable to it because they imagine this as something that makes people's lives better. Why should we stand in the way of Palestinians if they wish to make their lives better? Why should we insist more than anyone else in the world that Palestinians have to stay on their destructed land, which we had no choice but to destroy? So the thought process goes, and force them to suffer in the name of a nationalistic ideal. Let them go away. Let them lead a better life. What's so bad about it? And I think what gets lost in this is, for consent to be given freely, it has to not be manipulated. If I manipulate the costs and benefits far enough, it can become coercive even if I don't push you out physically. The second is, the Palestinian might ask, why not give me the possibility of rebuilding on my own land? And then the argument has to be something along the lines of, you lost that when you attacked on October 7th, but then you're no longer in the realm of consent, you're in the realm of punishment.
Yeah, and collective punishment at that.
Exactly, of a society that, while it may be supportive of its government in Poland, although Hamas pre-war was faring pretty badly in polling in Gaza, and post-war we'll see where it lands again, hasn't had an election since 2006. And most of the Gazan population is younger than 18 years old. They didn't vote in that election.
Yeah.
And so they might be supportive of their autocratic government, and it is an autocratic, almost totalitarian government. But the idea that the people bear responsibility so direct as to the actions of their government that you can then condemn their entire future on the basis of it is something that seems to me deeply illiberal in its commitments.
Yes.
This is where my moral objection to these kinds of plans come in. And if something like this is to be truly free, then it has to have more options than leave and get a packet of money or stay and be immiserated. That's not what we consider autonomous choice in liberal thought.
No, and none of this excludes, if individual Palestinians want to leave, I think surely they must, if anyone qualifies as refugees, like given what's happened to Gaza, they do. Like, but the countries, like, is the US gonna now liberalize our or the UK or whoever asylum systems? Because at the moment, those countries are really not taking much of anybody from any.
If anything, the move is in the other direction.
To close borders, yeah.
This is another stunning bit of this to me, that all of this conversation is happening at a time where the people having this conversation are seeking to repatriate some of the refugees that made it their way or close down borders. If this was happening in the context of the conversation about open borders, it would look a little different, or a lot different than the way it's being conducted right now.
It still wouldn't get you out from under the "what if Palestinians want to stay" question, but it would be at least be a little less grotesquely hypocritical. But I mean, the logic of consent. If we want to make consent our basic building block here, and there's maybe just sort of raw utilitarian calculuses to put in alongside that. But if we wanted to make consent our building block, I think you'd say, like, the true consent happens when you make both options as feasible and attractive as possible and let people make their own decisions. So what would that look like in this case? Well, like I say, a liberalized asylum system where, like, if your house has been blown up and you think, I want to try and set up a life for my family elsewhere, there are options for you there. But also, like, if you want to say, I want to stay and rebuild, there is support for you to do that too. Like, we can build a Riviera on the Med or whatever he called it and not expel the entire population. We can build a Riviera on the Med and hand it back over to, hopefully, ideally not Hamas, but to some sort of administration that would have standing with the people. Like, you can do both. Like, if the goal really, if the moral, if our starting point is consent, then you can say, let's do everything we can for the people who want to stay, everything we can for the people who want to leave. And the one thing we're not lacking here is money. America has money. And that would be it. It's as you say, it's a sort of perversion of the idea of consent in order to get you to a place that people want to be, because it's easier to think about it that way. It's easier to just think, what if we didn't have to work out what a stable, peaceful living arrangement is?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my
and I will say to this, it is important for me to say, in the aftermath of October 7th, I understand the sentiment. The sentiment that says the world is willing to make this problem go away. I just make it go away. Don't make me think about committing ethnic cleansing myself. I don't want to do that, but make the problem go away in a way that doesn't make me feel bad about it. Is a perfectly understandable way of thinking about the problem. I understand it. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's just, but I understand where they're coming from. Where I hope it leads is that once they realize it's not happening, and just the other day, Steve Witkoff, Trump's emissary to the peace process, basically said, we're not going in that direction anymore. We just wanted to start a conversation. The conversation has started. And Trump will probably mention his Gaza plan more than once going down the line, but the policy doesn't seem to be going in that direction. If it does lead to reinvigorated discussions about the Gaza rebuilding and bringing in other forces, and Israel finally agreeing to chart, not Israel, because within Israel there were actually a lot of people, and there continue to be a lot of people who understood the value of talking about the day after. But Netanyahu concedes and is willing to, or forced by Trump, to have a conversation about the day after. It's an outcome I'll be pleased with, because for Israel's sake and Israel's interests, as well as the well-being of the Palestinians, something has to change. Gaza can't remain under Hamas's boot if things are to get better. Right now, it doesn't seem like there's any other plan the way other than either more war or Hamas coming back as sort of a crippled version of itself from before. And that's not where I want to stand. I want to stand in a more secure state of affairs where the Palestinians rule themselves with some degree of, at least for the time being, monitoring. But both for them and for us, I think it has to go in a better direction. If this ends up leading there through a convoluted set of affairs, that would be great. The idea itself of depopulating Gaza, I think I both understand why it became so popular among Israelis and why Israelis love it so much, but I also am deeply concerned about that sentiment and about the thoughts about putting it into motion by ourselves.
Where are we going to end with? Because it's still, I mean, the central criticism, I think, of Israel is not just there's human rights violations you could point to in terms of denying aid or tolerating excessive civilian casualties. There's never been clearly stated war aims. Like you say, there's what's the day after plan, and it just seems to be that there never has been one. No Hamas, okay, cool, but what does that look like in terms of some sort of provisional government? There has never been that. It seems to me there still isn't that. And are we just here in another 2 years? Like, I mean, obviously neither of us have a crystal ball. It doesn't make, I don't feel super hopeful overall.
Just like you say, we don't have a crystal ball, and I don't want to hazard a guess where this goes. Things can change very, very quickly. Just thinking about the past, in '73, Israel fights a war that feels like a survival war, but a surprise war with Egypt and Syria, and 5 years later, it signs a peace accord with Egypt. Things can move very, very quickly once they're set in motion. What I think, and the other thing I would say is, within Israeli decision-making circles, high decision-making circles, from the outset of the war, there was a discussion of the day after plan. The goals of the war don't include a specification of what that needs to look like. The goals of the war, as set by the Israeli government, talk about dismantling Hamas's military and governmental capability. But not what comes in place of it. Netanyahu has stopped any decision-making from happening, specifically about what comes instead. I think that there are possibilities, or there are options, and there are world paths where it leads to some sort of reformed self-Palestinian rule along the lines of some of the ideas that have been floated as part of a broader regional deal. Right now, it doesn't feel like the most likely outcome. Right now, the most likely outcome feels like either a crippled Hamas or some sort of Israeli rule in areas of Gaza that struggles to put in place less cohesive, less overarching Palestinian self-rule, kind of subcontractors broken up into specific areas. I hope that's not where we end up, because that just sets up the ground for the next evolution of the conflict instead of any deeper stabilization, not to mention healing, which is so far out of the realm of possible right now. But I'd even opt for stabilization. Right now, that doesn't seem like the most likely outcome. Do I hope that that's what comes out of the mess in which we're in right now? I hope so. We talked about Trump's broader efforts in the area, or if you want to call it that, of international politics. I think this is one area where he has the potential, just because of how he does things, this approach to just cutting through all of it and not being deeply friendly with anybody, even with people who have been longtime friends of America, and not having these qualms and commitments to just cut through all of it. I don't think necessarily to lead to what we would have considered, or people on the left would have considered, a just outcome before, but something more of an outcome than what the Israeli right would have been willing to agree to otherwise. It can also end in annexation, so it can go in various ways. It's not a very predictable way, not a very predictable outcome, but it does have the potential of ending up in places that Netanyahu would not have ended up with had it not been Trump in the White House.
I don't want to say anything final thought that would rule those outcomes out. And I think, who knows, like, you can get turnarounds in relations from seemingly horrible, hopeless situations. I just wonder if what we're in is a holding pattern and then someone will lash out at the other, or both sides will lash out. We'll end up in another conflict. And then there'll be a long, winding path that ends in annexation. Is sort of...
That's possible. It might not even be that long or widening.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even hazard handing out probabilities about each of these outcomes at this point. I think they're all within the realm of possible now.
All right. On that dispiriting thought, let's draw it to a close. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciated that. Any way you'd like to direct listeners to follow you, Blue Sky website, anything like that?
Blue Sky. Avishay BSG. Avishay BSG.
Cool. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Toby. Pleasure.